This is the first of the thematic lectures we're going to do. We're going to look at the early Cold War. We're going to look at the civil rights movement. We're going to look at Vietnam, that are going to go over a number of different chapters. So we're going to start really at the end of World War II here. And the awkward wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union collapsed during the spring and summer of 1945, when the war was actually still going on, before Germany had even fully been defeated and Japan had fully been defeated. But when you have the elimination of the common enemy, Nazism, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, the two nations actually became pretty intense global rivals who couldn't overcome their ideological differences. Basic ideas such as how they saw human rights, how they saw individual liberties, what their beliefs were on democratic elections and religious freedom. And there was an intense mutual suspicion, and it led to a race to gain influence over non-aligned nations in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Central and South America that further created distance between these, again, allies who'd never really been on totally the same page. The defeat of Germany and then Japan had created power vacuums in Europe and Asia that sort of brought the United States and the Soviet Union into this unrelenting war of words that was fed by clashing strategic interests and political ideologies. So there's going to be this quote-unquote war that is fought without the U.S. and the Soviet Union ever really coming into direct conflict that often, but there's going to be proxy wars fought all over the world where they're fighting for influence. So historians have long debated this pretty unanswerable question. Was it the United States or the Soviet Union that was actually more responsible for the onset of the Cold War? Now, there's a conventional view that argues that it was the Soviets and Stalin, who was a ruthless communist dictator who set out to dominate the globe, and the United States had no choice but to defend democratic capitalist values. Now, there's another line of thinking that says, you know what? Roosevelt had actually tried to collaborate with the Soviets. But when Truman came in, he pursued a confrontational foreign policy that only aggravated tensions. But at the end of the day, this latter interpretation fails to recognize that Truman came in and inherited a deteriorating relationship with the Soviets, that when Roosevelt died, it was not great with the Soviets to begin with, and that both sides in this post-war world actually played a major role in terms of building, fear and suspicion and posturing. So neither side necessarily is innocent. But the onset of the Cold War really seems to have been inevitable when we look back at it. America had a commitment to capitalism, political self-determination, and religious freedom. Okay, we know that. But it conflicted dramatically with the Soviet Union's preference for controlling its neighbors, for enforcing ideological conformity, for prohibiting religious practices. So it was these insecurities as much as communist ideology that drove much of Soviet behavior after World War II. If you think about it, again, Russia had been invaded by Germany twice in the first half of the 20th century, and 23 million people died as a result. In their mind, they had every right to create loyal nations on their borders to buffer them as protection. To them, this was a matter of survival. So, what we're going to see happen as a result of the broken promises of Yalta, and again, we talked about this during World War II, but the Soviet Union violated the promises it made at the Yalta Conference, and it imposed military control and the communist political system on the nations of Eastern Europe that had quote-unquote liberated. And again, most famously, it didn't allow free elections in Poland, which was a sign again to Roosevelt and then later to Truman that the Soviets cannot be trusted. And 4 days after VE Day, so technically, still fighting against Japan, Churchill had asked Truman what's to happen to Europe. He said, it seems that an iron curtain is drawn down upon the Russian front, and we don't know what's going on behind it. And as early as the spring of 45, again, the war is still going on, and for the next 2 years after that, the Soviets systematically imprisoned half of the European continent, putting it behind, quote-unquote, that iron curtain. The Soviets installed puppet governments. That means governments that are controlled by Soviet allies. Oftentimes they'd pretend to have democratic elections, but they were all, predetermined ahead of time. And these puppet governments were across Central and Eastern Europe: Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Although in Yugoslavia, they had a communist leader who actually didn't do what the Soviets wanted. That was Tito, was his name. And in the Soviets' ruthless pursuit of total control, they eliminated all political parties except the communists. They created secret police forces. They took control of intellectual and cultural life, including the mass media. They undermined the Roman Catholic Church. And they organized the process of ethnic cleansing, whereby whole populations, 12 million Germans, as well as Poles and Hungarians, were relocated from their homes in Eastern Europe, usually to West Germany or to prison. And anyone who opposed the Soviets was either silenced, exiled, executed, or imprisoned. Okay? So we sort of think of 1945 to 1947 as this trying to figure out what exactly is going on in the Soviet Union, becoming concerned about what's going on, but by 47, really trying to get to the bottom of it. So relations had grown so cold by 47 that the United States was really worried, because in 46, Stalin had announced basically, communist system is superior, and he declared that peace was impossible under the present system of capitalism in the world. And such a provocative statement led the State Department of the United States to demand an analysis of Soviet communism. And they asked a man named George F. Kennan, who was the best informed expert on the Soviet Union, and he was then working at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. So he famously writes in what is known as the Long Telegram, because it is incredibly long. He explains that the Soviet Union was founded on a rigid ideology of Marxism and Leninism, which saw a fundamental global conflict between communism and capitalist nations. So it's this conflict and this perpetuation and this constant explanation of the conflict that helped Soviet rulers justify what he thought was immoral actions. And he said that the Soviets could not imagine, could not conceive of any permanent, peaceful coexistence with capitalist nations, and they were fanatically committed to a basically perpetual conflict and tension. So in Kennan's mind, Roosevelt's original assumption that he could sort of use his personal diplomacy to control Stalin was totally incorrect. Instead, Kennan thought that Stalin always needed external enemies to maintain his totalitarian power at home. So there was no such thing as being Stalin's friend. And in Kennan's advice, the best way for the United States to deal with such an ideological fanatic was through patient, persistent, and firm strategic efforts to quote-unquote contain Soviet expansionism without resorting to war. In his mind, the economic power of capitalist democracies was the greatest asset. So basically, his idea was to create what he called unalterable counterforce to communist expansion, okay? And in doing so, if you were constantly sort of opposing them, again without going to war, it would eventually cause either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power, because in his mind, communism was an inherently unstable system that would eventually collapse. So basically, you had to keep countering it, and it would break down. So in its broadest dimension, the Long Telegram called for what was known as firm and vigilant containment. And we're going to see the first example of this being used in Greece and Turkey. So in 1946, civil war broke out in Greece between the authoritarian monarchy, again, authoritarian monarchy, so it's going to be people aren't very happy with it, but they're backed by the British. And then there's the opposition, which was basically a communist insurgency supported by the Soviets. So what you had in Greece was a group that wasn't very well liked, but it was backed by democratic countries. And then you also had sort of the communist rebels trying to take over. And in February of 1947, Britain basically said to the United States, we can't handle this anymore. We can't keep providing economic and military aid to Greece, and we're going to be done with it in about a month. So Truman met with his congressional leaders, and basically they said, you need to scare the hell out of the American people about the menace of communism, because you need to come up with a major aid package. So in early 1947, Truman does that. He gives a national radio speech in which he asks Congress for $400 million, again, not that much, for economic and military assistance for Greece and neighboring Turkey. Most importantly, he announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. And he basically exaggerated the danger of communist takeover in Greece in trying to get Congress on board. He set up this idea of the domino theory, which we're going to talk more about basically in Vietnam. But he basically said if Greece falls to communism, all the other nations of the Eastern Mediterranean and then the rest of Europe will all fall to communism. So he said, famously, the United States must support free peoples, again, people who are not under control of communists, who are resisting attempted subjugation, that means takeover, by armed minorities, again, that's going to be a smaller group like those communist rebels, or by outside pressure. So basically he's saying, if anybody's threatened by communism, either internally or externally, we need to come help. And in this single sentence, basically, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, the president established the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for the next 40 years. And in essence, he was declaring war on communism everywhere. Now, George Kennan, again, the architect of containment, cringed at Truman's grandiose commitment to contain communism everywhere. In his view, Truman had really militarized this view of the Cold War, and it was a foolish crusade. And in his mind, it was an open-ended ideological confrontation without limits, rather than a specific policy with an accompanying program of steps capable of implementation. Now, in Kennan's mind, containing communism needed to be selectively implemented rather than this sort of broad, universal political and economic proclamation, okay? Now, in Kennan's mind and in other critics' minds, the United States could not go intervene in every hotspot around the world, but that's essentially what the Truman Doctrine was saying, okay? Now, for $400 million, the United States was able to keep that armed insurgency away, and neither Greece nor Turkey fell to communism. Now, it's important to note that in that spring of 47, sort of this consequential year where the United States is really evaluating what is going on, most of post-war Europe remained broke, shattered, and desperate. Factories had been bombed to rubble, railroads and bridges had been destroyed, millions upon millions were homeless, starving, and jobless. There's political unrest growing. It's important to realize that in this sort of economic instability, socialist and communist parties were emerging, including important countries like Italy, France, and Belgium. And so the United States looked at these crises among European democracies and said, we need bold action. So in the spring of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall delivered a very famous speech at Harvard in which he outlined America's political policies towards Europe, okay? What became known as the Marshall Plan was intended to reconstruct the European economy and to neutralize these sort of growing communist forces and build up foreign markets for American products. It's very important to understand. The thinking was that if you can rebuild Europe economically, they won't fall prey to the allure of communism, and then you can have, again, democratic capitalism. But the Marshall Plan was also part of Truman's effort to contain the sort of expansionist tendencies of the Soviet Union by reestablishing a strong Western Europe anchored in American values. Basically, we're going to buy their love in many ways, okay? So in December of 47, Truman submits Marshall's proposal to Congress. And initially, Republicans dismissed it. They're like, that's just the New Deal in Europe, okay? However, in early 1948, a communist-led coup in Czechoslovakia, which was the last nation in Eastern Europe with a democratic government, happened. So all of a sudden, Congress, which was dragging its feet, said, we need to get it done, okay? So the Marshall Plan was passed. And in 3 years, really, from 48 to 51, the Marshall Plan provided $13 billion to 16 European nations. Now, the Soviets refused to participate, even though they were technically offered Marshall Plan funding, and forced all their, puppet governments to refuse as well. The Marshall Plan, which was officially called the European Recovery Plan, worked beautifully. By 1951, Western Europe's industrial production had soared to 40% above pre-war levels, and its farm output was larger than ever. So it's really important to understand that basically for $400 million, the Truman Doctrine, you're able to get Greece and Turkey that didn't go communist. For $13 billion, you were able to basically rebuild Western Europe. So the United States had very early success in this Cold War in terms of funding European recovery to keep communism away.